of variables is we've done an experiment now. We did the peanut experiment last week. We now need some way to talk about that experiment. We need some scientific language to be able to describe the things that we did. Some terminology that will allow us to identify particular aspects of that experiment. And that's where this idea of the variable comes in. Scientific language that we can use to describe. So, the first one that we've got is saying that the dependent variable is the variable that we are measuring. Okay, so if that's our dependent variable, right, so anybody other than James for the next, although James did give a clue for one of the other two variable types. So a variable that the experimenter sets, or a variable that may not change, but that could be affected by the results of the experiment. Carl, you've got a 50-50 chance here.
The variable that the experimenter sets is control.
It isn't.
Is it?
No.
Well,
And if it's not control, what does that mean it is?
the other one.
Excellent. Well, come and drag it down for me.
I'll be quiet when you check on this.
It's worth a try. That's it. It's like you've never been away, Carl. Excellent. Okay. So, the independent variable is the variable that the experimenter sets. The dependent variable is a variable that is being measured. So, Zahara, how are we going to describe the control variable on this table? If those two are the one that the experimenter sets and the variable that's being measured, what's our final definition? And where does it go in the table? Excellent stuff, come on. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Is a control not set by the experimenter though?
Control variables, these are generally actually one of the more confusing ones. The control variables, you can have lots of control variables in an experiment,
Right.
some of which might be set by the experimenter, some of which might be just due to the conditions
Oh, right,
that
okay.
are around the experiment. There's one key sort of control variable that we've come across a couple of times in the two experiments that we've done so far in this unit. Does anyone know what that control variable might be? Yeah, it is. We could do the accuracy experiment that we did in the first week in the morning and get different results to the accuracy experiment that we did in the afternoon because the temperature of the room had changed. So actually temperature is a very common control variable because it has an effect on all sorts of things. The rate of a reaction is speeded up with an increase in temperature. Volumes are increased with an increase in temperature. So there are a lot of different, temperature is a very common one, but there are actually a lot of different control variables that we need to take into account depending on our specific
We're
condition.
measuring the temperature of the water. How the temperature of the water increase.
Yeah. It's the temperature of the water that we were collecting. So they were the results that we were collecting was the temperature of the water. So actually one of the things, so we know it changed because it went up. So it's definitely a variable. And actually it is the dependent variable because it's the variable that we measured. It's the temperature. Okay, come on then, James. I know you're eager to give us one of them. So if the temperature is the dependent variable, how are we doing on the independent variable?
Would that be the time?
Yes, it would. Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's see. Dependent and now, interestingly, we will come back to dependent and independent variables in future experiments, and I will ask you guys to identify, which out of these is our independent variable and which out of the results that you've got is our dependent variable. But the independent, there is a relatively easy way of remembering the independent variable. And that's because it's the one that we set. So before we go into an experiment, you guys will have a sort of rough results table that you're going to note your results down in during the course of the experiment. And last week, that results table looked a little bit like 20, 40, 60, 80. So before the experiment, when we hadn't run the experiment, our results table looked like that. The independent variable is always the one that you've written down before the experiment. So whatever you've got written down in your results table before the experiment, on the left-hand side usually, is the independent variable. Because it's the one that you're deciding on. You're saying, I'm going to measure this experiment, I'm going to measure the temperature every 20 seconds. So it's because that's the one that you're setting. We could say, I'm going to measure the temperature every 10 seconds. So the independent variable will be every 10 seconds rather than every 20 seconds. But the thing is, you're deciding that time frame. So that's the one that you set. And like I say, before you go into an experiment, the one on the left-hand side, when you haven't yet collected your results but your table is ready, is the independent variable. We then collected our results, which would have looked a little bit like 24, 28, 31, 39. So the one that we then fill in during the course of the experiment is the dependent variable. And this is where the name gives a little bit of a clue, because the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. If we decided to take these results every 10 seconds, these numbers would be different. I mean, the end number and the start number would be the same, but the numbers in between would be different. So the variable that we measure during the experiment is the dependent variable. Okay, everyone happy with those two ideas? Samantha, you all right back there? Excellent. Okie dokie. So, time, temperature, but Leslie, you did mention another thing that we measured as a result of that experiment. Yes, we did measure the weight of the peanut. Now that doesn't actually sort of change the running of our experiment, but a heavier peanut would give us a higher final temperature. So that is something that we need to take into consideration, particularly if we want to compare results between teams. Say again? Yeah, it would. So there'd be more energy, so the temperature of the water would go up. There are some other control variables for this experiment. Go on, James.
I was going to say the amount of water.
Amount of water. Leslie, you were almost there with the amount of water as well. Does everyone else agree with that? The amount of water is something that we had to take into consideration when we did that experiment. Tabitha? The amount of water. We had to control that for the experiment. And that is another control variable. We double the volume of water, then the amount that the temperature has increased, or that it increases halves. That does affect the outcome of our results, and we need to make sure that we're aware of that beforehand. So, hopefully we've now all got this idea of there being different types of variable within an experiment, so different things that can change within an experiment. And we've got some language that we can use to describe those variables. Like I say, we will start talking about variables in experiments that we do in the future. Part of the assessment at the end of the lab skills unit actually asks you to identify the variables within your experiment, the experiment that we'll do at the end of the unit. So we'll make sure that we use it week on week. You guys should, by the end of the unit, should be well familiar with identifying your independent variables, which are your dependent variables, and should be quite happy starting to talk about the experiment in terms of those things.